3 years after forging the landmark Paris Climate Agreement, world leaders are meeting in Poland for 2 weeks and this is a meeting for the 24th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP24, to create a rulebook that will turn the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement into a workable reality. The COP24 meets to decide on how to turn emission-cutting pledges into reality. It's the most important meeting on climate change this year, with a glaring absence of the US and a disconnect between climate scientists and politicians on the perils of inaction, with nationalist leaders like Donald Trump pursuing a fossil fuel friendly policy, and UN's climate chief has said that this year is likely to be one of the 4 hottest years on record. Greenhouse gases concentration in the atmosphere are at a record level and emissions continue to rise. Climate change impacts have never been worse. This reality is telling us that we need to do much more, and COP24 needs to make that happen as well. And well, joining us to talk a little bit more about this is the former top UN climate expert Christiana Figueres, who is joining us live now. And Christiana Figueres, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. You've been the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2010 to 2016. And just to introduce our guests a little more, Christiana Figueres has also been credited with much of the work that has been done on the climate change discussions over the last decade or more. And thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now, where are we on this very complex negotiation process on climate change policies, a negotiation that is both extremely technical at many levels and also extremely political?
Yes, absolutely. And we're actually in 2 different places at the same time. On the one hand, we're in a very complex technical discussion in Poland that is not really understood by people who are far away from the center, but that can be simplified to a political conversation about what are the responsibilities of developed countries going to be vis-a-vis developing countries, among other things, in providing financial support in exchange for more and more transparency on the efforts that are being done worldwide. That is one reality. The other reality that we have at the same time is the reality of transformation that is occurring in many countries around the world, including the United States, whose government claims not to understand climate change. But in fact, among most countries in the world, there is already a realization that decarbonizing the economy is actually something that should be done, not necessarily to save the world, but actually to strengthen the economy and to have a better, more vibrant, more prosperous economy in the long run.
Right. And then the question, of course, also is to be asked, how much of the climate change is actually reversible? And to reverse it, aren't we really looking for a revolution then?
Yes, well, sadly, it is not correct to say that climate change can actually be solved, because much of the damage, much of the concentrations that are already up there in the global's atmosphere can actually not be diminished unless we invent a very, very powerful methodology and technology that we don't have yet. So what we're trying to do is to curb the growth, the increase of those emissions in the global atmosphere, to keep the negative impacts of climate change, of which we have already seen many, including here in India, to keep those within a range of manageable damage. We do not want to cross very dangerous thresholds of moving into the arena of unmanageable damage, both to physical infrastructure as well as to financial stability. So what we're trying to do is to shave off the worst impacts, to protect the most vulnerable populations around the world, and to bring this back to a situation that we would be able to manage in the future.
Right, and we would be able to manage in the future, but the pace of these negotiations over the years has been slow for various reasons, financial being one of them, and political being the other. Do you think that there is enough initiative from individual world leaders to bring this change?
Well, actually, I think that today and yesterday and tomorrow, there's never enough, because we all should be so focused on this world emergency that is the greatest challenge that we're facing in the 21st century. So it is never enough. However, there is a growing engagement from world leaders, not just political leaders, but in particular from world corporate leaders, from financial leaders, from insurance company leaders, from subnational government leaders who understand that, yes, we do have an emergency, but at the same time, that emergency represents a huge opportunity to bring the economy of their respective constituency into the 21st century. It does us no good to stay with the technologies and the financial constructs that were built and that were prosperous and were very helpful toward the 20th century. To bring that into the 21st century makes no sense because they have actually run their course.
Okay.
So moving into the 21st century with the technologies that we have now, with new financial constructs, that is the challenge ahead of us. And we have an increasing number of visionary people who are moving into that space.
Right, and we talk about a lot of visionary people and also a lot of world leaders who are committed to this, but the glaring absence of Donald Trump, who is the US president, would certainly impact how the climate change policies are shaped. US being one of the worst polluting countries in the world, it tops the list.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's second, yes, after China, but it carries the most historical responsibility in years back. So sadly, because the President of the United States has not wished to understand what climate change is and the dangers that it is causing, the negative impacts that it is causing, that actually puts the economy of the United States in a very uncompetitive position, because it means that there are not enough incentives for U.S.-produced technology to actually move forward into the decarbonization possibility that is the huge market possibility of this decade and next decade. So sadly, he is causing himself and his economy a huge handicap by this. Now, on the other hand, we also do see that there are a growing number of states in the United States, a growing number of cities. We're already up to 13 states. We're up to 300 cities, thousands of corporations that understand that it is in their interest. And so they are moving forward with or without the White House.
Okay. And what do you think, Christiana Figueres, of India's role? How is that panned out, and how much of what we set out to achieve have we achieved, according to you?
Well, what has been very impressive certainly was the intellectual and conceptual support and contribution that India gave in that moment toward the bringing together of all countries for the Paris Agreement. But since then, what is remarkable is how India has really pushed forward in solar energy, how it has pushed forward in wind, how it is now increasingly getting committed to offshore wind, to all of the new energy sources that are going to be able to provide India with a very interesting possibility of being able to produce the energy that it needs from homegrown sources and not have to import fossil fuel sources that are going to be actually quite expensive from a national budget point of view.
Right. You say that we've done enough on, increasing our reliance on solar energy. There is that International Solar Alliance that was hugely successful here in India as well. Now, we've also promised to increase our carbon sink and increase our dependence on non-fossil fuels in our carbon mix to up to 40%. But we don't have the figures of actually how much of that's happening at the ground level, the specifics of it, when you see the housing structures that are being built without dependence on solar energies. And one of the things that critics say is possibly because the transfer of technology in solar energy is very high still.
Well, actually, I think India has a very good hand already on the technology of solar generation. I don't think that there is a gap there. I think that's very well ingrained in solar. However, I do think that it's very worthwhile thinking about a potential universal and global leadership of India with respect to the development of the technology of energy storage. The fact is that the world is moving irreversibly toward a decarbonized energy matrix, and that energy matrix is going to need energy storage, which we don't have yet at the scale and at the price that is needed. And hence there is a huge opportunity to create many jobs, to attract much investment into India, were India to look at the storage, energy storage, as a huge growth opportunity for the economy of India. There's currently no country that has taken a lead on that, and there is a very open opportunity and invitation for India to actually do that.
Right, and at the COP24 now, we've already heard that there are issues about certain countries not want to be sharing, the financial burden of this. Turkey, we believe, is asked to be categorized as a developing country, not a developed nation. So the financial aspect of this continues to remain troublesome, and I continue to say this because Donald Trump has vowed not to back climate change the way the Obama administration had. So that puts the pressure on developing countries as well. The burden of that shifts to the mid-level countries in terms of financing this.
Yes, the fact is that the promise that was made by developed countries of transferring $100 billion per year starting in 2020, a north to south transfer of funding that includes both public and private, is actually in progress. And the latest numbers that we've seen is that last year there was already somewhere between 70 and $80 billion of financial flows that went from the north to the south for these types of challenges. So let's say that if that trend continues, we might be on track to hit 100 billion by 2020. However, I think it has to be said that 100 billion is very, very a small level of financial flows compared to the huge opportunities that are actually facing us. We're talking about a market of trillions of dollars that can be had by those countries that invest properly into ease of business, contextualization, that invest into the development of investment proposals that can go to the private sector, to the multilateral banks, to attract the kind and the level of investment that is necessary for this transition. There, I come back to the possibility that India could be the country that attracts most investment, both from public as well as from private sources, into a very nascent area, which is energy storage.
Right. And Christiana Figueres, now the UN report itself says that climate change's impact on countries like India would be very, very devastating, as half of the population here is dependent on agriculture. So it would really have a bad impact here. According to your own estimates, if climate change was not to be stopped as of now, and there is no consensus going forward, what are we really looking at? What are we staring at potentially here?
We're looking at scenarios that we certainly do not want to call into reality. We're looking at scenarios where we would have 30, 40 low-lying islands in the Pacific that would lose either the entirety of their territory or a substantial portion of their territory, forcing huge amounts of migrants that don't want to leave their home country, but that would be forced to do so in order to survive. We're looking at coastal areas around the world that currently house more than half the population. In fact, almost 60% of the world's population lives in low-lying coastal areas on mainlands. We're looking at substantial flooding and increase of sea levels there. We're looking at mountain chains like the Himalayas here and the Andes in South America having such ice melt that we would be seriously impairing the water availability, both for human drinking as well as from agriculture. We're looking at areas in the Sahel that would accelerate the process that they're already in of increasing drying of the earth, the desertification of becoming a greater desert, also impacting food security and livelihood of those people. So these are all situations that we do not want to allow. And that is why it is so important to understand that we all need to collaborate and work together in order to ensure that while temperature continues to rise, because we still have emissions, we must do everything that we can in order to ensure that the maximum temperature rise that the world would reach is 1.5 degrees. And for that, we need to bend the curve of emissions by 2020 and continue their descent over the next few decades until we come to a zero net emissions by 2050.
Well, and finally, Christiana Figueres, what do you think is the underlying fundamental message coming out of COP24? And as somebody who has been on the negotiating table for so long, what are the major roadblocks that this particular meeting will want to sort of solve in order to move forward?
Well, as in every negotiation, there are various layers of issues that are on the table. So the first is, and which is taking up a lot of time of the technical people who are there, are the technical details of monitoring, reporting, and verifying, i.e. all of the family of transparency tools that need to be used by all countries in order to allow everyone to keep track of, are we actually bringing down, reducing our emissions or not? So that's very, very technical work that needs to be done. At the political level, there is, again, the question that is not new. It is a very long tail of a question that has been with us ever since the 1990s of how is this going to be financed? Because there is no doubt that there is historical responsibility on the part of industrialized countries. There's also no doubt that there is future responsibility of all countries. And the spirit of the Paris Agreement was precisely to respect historical responsibility fundamentally, but also to understand that that there is, while differentiated, there is future responsibility of everyone, and that it behooves every country, every sector, every level of government around the world to collaborate in order to ensure that we are protecting the most vulnerable and we are building an economy that is safer, more secure, and more prosperous.
All right, Christiana Figueres, the former UN climate chief, thanks very much indeed for giving us your time and sharing your thoughts on this very important meeting taking place on climate change in Poland. Thanks very much.